Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. On this episode of Barkeep Upkeep, I will be discussing the massive errata that Oubliette received that will take effect when Double Masters gets released. I don't want to get too ahead of myself with recent erratas or WotC's sometimes disjoint and incohesive logic for them, but at least for now, let's see what's up with Oubliette and how the errata affects how it plays. If you're thinking of buying any cards, please consider using my TCGPLAYER affiliate link when doing so. It really helps out the channel. You can find the link to it down in the description. Another major way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For as little as $1, you get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server. You can find a link to both down in the description. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Oubliette was last printed as a common in Arabian Nights, where it was originally printed, and its text was quite wordy to say the least. Its only other reprint was in digital form in the first Masters Edition for Magic Online, where it was done so with its updated Oracle text. Oubliette sees play in Pauper as well as Commander. Essentially, Oubliette is like Journey to Nowhere in that there are two separate triggers, unlike something like Stasis Snare, which has the exile and return to play effect in the same trigger. The difference here is quite simple. If you target a creature with Journey to Nowhere and hold priority while that triggers on the stack, and then cast Disenchant on it, for example, when Disenchant resolves, Journey to Nowhere is destroyed. Since it had not exiled anything, its second triggered ability does nothing. However, its first ability's trigger is still on the stack. That then resolves, essentially permanently exiling the creature. You can't do this with Stasis Snare since the exile effect has a delayed trigger for when it leaves the battlefield. This is similar to Fiend Hunter and Banisher Priest. Notice that Fiend Hunter has two different triggers, one for when it enters the battlefield and the other for when it leaves. But Banisher Priest has its exit clause in the same trigger. This means that you can bounce or flicker Fiend Hunter in response to its first trigger, essentially permanently exiling the creature it may exile, but this will not happen with Banisher Priest. The former is how Oubliette works, or I should say used to work. In response to Oubliette's Enter the Battlefield trigger, you would make Oubliette leave the battlefield. So not only would that exile the creature, but all auras attached to it as well. If you exile a creature with Journey to Nowhere, the auras go to the graveyard as a state-based action, but they're exiled along with the creature by Oubliette. This is something you could take a lot of advantage of with Voltron commanders. Before you cast a board wipe, you can target your own commander with it, exiling it and all auras attached and counters on it. Then, when Oubliette is destroyed along with the rest of the board, your commander returns to the battlefield tapped while still having any counters on it and any auras attached to it. Since the ability specifies auras, any equipment attached to the creature will not be exiled with Oubliette's ability, so keep that in mind. The kinds of temporary exile effects from Journey to Nowhere, etc. still has your creature lose all of its counters, so any +1/+1 counters or keyword counters you worked so hard to get on your creature are lost. But not if you exile it with Oubliette. The only thing you lose for your creature this way is if you gave it some ability that does not go away at the end of the turn, like the +2/+2 and Horsemanship that Riding the Deluge Horse gives, or the keywords that Nature's Blessing give, among other similar cards and effects, etc. The point is that Oubliette's ability exiles the creature with all counters it has on it and all auras attached to it. Then, when Oubliette leaves the battlefield, those cards it exiled returns with the creature returning tapped. Now let's look at how they quote-unquote solved the problem with Oubliette. From Tolarian Community College's latest video with the professor's preview card for Oubliette, although it was a comedy sketch, one of the supposed reasons for never reprinting Oubliette on paper was because of how wordy its text was. However, I choose to disagree. The Grand Calcutron is a card that's way more wordy than Oubliette's Oracle text, and it still fit in the text box. In fact, look at what Oubliette would look like with its Oracle wording inside of its text box. I don't really see an issue here. So I don't know if that excuse given in the video was just part of the skit or if it has a thread of truth in it. In any case, the quote-unquote solution to this issue was errataing Oubliette to now phase out the creature and everything attached to it until Oubliette leaves the battlefield. This errata is so massive, it's practically a new card. Instead of reprinting Oubliette, they made a new card with the same casting cost and named it Oubliette. Let's go a bit deeper as to why this is so different. Let's start with what I first mentioned. Oubliette exiles a creature with all auras attached to it, and the creature keeps any counters it had on it. It doesn't exile any equipment attached to the creature. This new Oubliette phases out the creature, meaning that not just auras but equipment are phased out as well. So this change is twofold. For one thing, getting exiled and phasing out are two completely different things. When a card is exiled, it goes to the exile zone. When a card phases out, it ceases to exist altogether until it phases back in. it doesn't go to any particular zone. So, for example, if you target a commander with Oubliette, it can't go to the command zone as a state-based action. Also, it affects effects that care about things being exiled. You would think that this alone would account for a massive change to how Oubliette used to work, and you'd be right, but that's not all. The change is even more massive. If you remember from my explanation a while ago about Oubliette having two separate triggers like Fiend Hunter, well now it only has one trigger like Banisher Priest. So those tricks we were able to do with Oubliette that I mentioned earlier can no longer be done. If you remove Oubliette from the battlefield in response to its ability entering the stack, whatever it phases out will just phase right back in afterwards. Either way, with the way phasing works, when something is phased out, it phases back in at the beginning of its controller's next untap step. So even if Oubliette still had two different triggers, you wouldn't be able to leave its target permanently phased out because that's not how phasing works. In this case, it's phased out until Oubliette leaves the battlefield. In order for it to be permanently phased out, you would have to take away a player's untap step. So with this massive errata, was Oubliette really reprinted in Double Masters? I'm gonna have to say no. The errata is so considerable that it's not the same card. It doesn't behave the same way. There are plenty of other rules interactions I can go into, but hopefully I was able to cover the glaring and major differences in how Oubliette is no longer the same in terms of what could be achieved with it. It is still a form of targeted removal in mono black that's not a permanent, as straight up killing a creature? Yes. Is it still like Journey to Nowhere? No way. This brings me to another point. Mark Rosewater has gone on record to say that they do not want to make any functional errata to any cards if they can avoid it. Changing creature types is one thing, but changing how a card works altogether is something else entirely. This is one reason why the Nephilim from Dissension have not been errata to be legendary, even though flavorfully it makes sense, and Mark himself has said that it was something they should have done in hindsight. However, they severely nerfed the companion mechanic with its update, thus errataing all 10 current companions. He had tweeted that this was not meant to be a precedent. This was done because of how warping the mechanic is, and instead of banning all 10 cards, the mechanic was simply changed. Even then, compared to nerfing the companion mechanic, which is basically an update to how a mechanic works, which granted has been done in the past, coincidentally with phasing itself. Phasing used to happen before untap, now it happens at the beginning of the untap step. Even then, Oubliette's errata is a more considerable change than the companion mechanic was. The companions, as cards, still work as intended. The only difference is that you can't cast them from your sideboard. You have to pay 3 at sorcery speed to get them into your hand first. But once on the battlefield, they still do what they're printed to do. The aspect of deck restriction in order to have them as a companion in your sideboard is also the same. Now, I was excited when I heard rumors about Oubliette being reprinted in Double Masters until I saw the text box. I'm sorry, but that is not Oubliette. And the Professor, if you're watching, I'm sorry, but you've been duped. Oubliette was not reprinted in Double Masters. Another card was reprinted instead under the same name. But it is what it is. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCGPLAYER affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of Barkeep Upkeep on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and thanks for listening.